several regions and countries. I'm joined by Olga Oliker, our Program Director for Europe and Central Asia, Ivan Briscoe, our Program Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Amanda Hsiao, who is our Senior Analyst on China. So from their bios, you'll get a sense of the kinds of topics we will be discussing. The midterms are effectively mostly over. We have, here in the US, we have one toss-up seat remaining in the House, where Republicans will either have a 4 or a 5 seat majority. I think the smallest incoming majority. So very slim and very unwieldy. In the Senate, we are awaiting a runoff election in Georgia, which will determine whether Democrats will control 51 seats, which would be a pickup of 1, which would have some procedural advantages. But as it stands, there has been a pickup already, so Democrats will continue to control the Senate. So some stability for the Biden administration, particularly with respect to nominations. So that's the picture. It's not the picture that many expected, and I think there was wide expectation for much worse results for Democrats. So for the Biden administration, that's obviously quite good news. But obviously, this will have a big change in some respects with the House of Representatives under Republican control. And so I think I will start with you, Olga, because in the run-up to the election, we saw comments from who we presume to be the incoming House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, about the uncertainty of the continuation of aid to Ukraine. There were sort of comments from someone like the senator-elect from Ohio, J.D. Vance, who effectively said he didn't care much what happened to Ukraine. There was a sense that this might become a kind of wedge issue for the Trumpian base of the party, particularly at a time of recession, potentially on the horizon, rising energy costs, continuing inflation, that this huge aid package to Ukraine might become something of a political wedge issue that might create sharp differences among the Republican caucus. And so I wanted to start with you to get a sense about your thoughts of whether there is stability in US policy toward Ukraine, or whether these undercurrents within the Republican Party are going to make any material difference going forward.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to everybody for joining us. So I have what I think is often a bit of a minority view, in that I don't worry that much about continuing unity, whether within any given Western country, including the United States, or the West more broadly, about support for Ukraine. Democracies show their dirty laundry by definition. So the debates are public and the debates are visible, and the fact that there isn't unanimity can make it look like there isn't consensus. But in fact, there is consensus. I mean, as you pointed out, Michael, it's within the Republican Party that you've got some fighting and some disagreement about just how important Ukraine is. But in general, there is broad consensus amongst Republicans and Democrats, one of very few things on which there is broad consensus, that the United States needs to keep supporting Ukraine, and that the United States needs to keep doing things to weaken and limit Russia. So in a broad sense, I'm not that worried. What I think we will see, what we're already starting to see, is more of a push for oversight of the assistance that's being provided. And, that isn't even necessarily going to wait until the new Congress is seated, because that's something that's been in the works for a while. But, if something changes U.S. policy, I don't think it's going to be pressure from the Congress. I think it's going to be events on the ground and what they drive the directions they drive the administration in.
Great, thank you. On the question of consensus, the other place where we have seen, one of the few places we've seen consensus among Republicans and Democrats, and where we've seen a bit of a bipartisan approach to foreign policy, has been China. And so I wanted to turn to you, Amanda, because again, we've seen the Taiwan Policy Act sail through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, although it still has a ways to go to actually become law. But the CHIPS Act, we saw a lot of bipartisan support around the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. There's been talk of a potential McCarthy visit to Taiwan in the future. But this is one of the few places where we've seen Republicans and Democrats agree on much of anything in the realm of foreign policy. And so I wonder, will this kind of hawkish turn that we've seen of late in congressional attitudes toward China continue? Or do you think this will play out in any in any different way, or do you see this more as a continuation of the current status quo? And maybe if you could touch on what that means for relations between Congress and the Biden administration, who haven't always seen eye to eye necessarily on China policy.
Sure, thanks, Michael. And let me just take a piece of one of your questions and focus on the midterm results and US policy on China first, and then maybe we can get to Taiwan a little bit after. But as you say, this is one of the few issues where we have seen a fair amount of bipartisan consensus, that consensus being that China is the US's top strategic competitor, and we are very likely to see the policy shift that was initiated really under the Trump administration, one in which Washington's posture towards Beijing has become much more confrontational, in which the value of engagement has really been widely derided. All of that will continue. We can see that there was continuity in the framing that is found in the recent US national security strategy that was released, the assessment that China is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the capabilities to advance that objective. And that has stayed consistent ever since the start of the Biden administration. And so, I don't think there's going to be really a shift in the overall direction of the US policy on China as a result of the midterms. What we are likely to see, however, is probably more scrutiny from a Republican House over how the Biden administration handles its China policy. There will likely be more noise about the Chinese threat, all of which may make it harder for the administration to make more substantive moves to improve the relationship, or even to put a floor under the relationship. The Biden administration, even though it has in many ways realized a more coherent strategy than the Trump administration to compete with China, it does state that it hopes to coexist with China. And we've seen in the recent Xi-Biden meeting on the sidelines of the G20, really an attempt to begin to put in that floor. The two leaders agreed to resume working level dialogues, and it was an important step in the right direction. But we've seen already that the administration has come under some criticism for that meeting from the Republicans, criticized for essentially being weak on China. So I think we can expect more of that line of argument from the Republicans, who will likely continue to use the China issue as a means of signaling their seriousness on national security issues.
Thanks, Amanda. I should say I'm going to ask a few more questions of my colleagues, and then at some point, about halfway through, we're going to open it up to questions from our attendees. And to ask those questions, just you'll be able to type your questions into the Q&A box. And if you could just state your name and affiliation when we get to that portion. Ivan, I wanted to turn to you and to think about the ways in which very particular state results might end up having ramifications for the region you cover. I mentioned that Democrats had a much better than expected night in the midterms, but one of the places they did not, that sort of defied some of these national trends, was the state of Florida. And as everybody is aware, the state of Florida has had an outsized role in shaping US approaches to Latin America. There has been a lot of solicitousness to various constituencies and communities, and that's obviously had long-term effects on US posture and approach on things like sanctions. And so I wonder, with the Republicans doing quite well, the state looking much less like a toss-up, something much more like a full-fledged red state, whether that in effect creates space for a Biden administration or future administrations to take a different approach to Latin America. How will that play out? Particularly, I think with Venezuela is the one that comes to mind. We've seen overtures, particularly after the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So, does this help that shift? Is that potentially a place where we see a continuation of this, of a change in policy?
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you everybody for joining us. I think you're absolutely right. There were two results here in the midterms as regards Latin America policy from the United States. One was the qualified Democratic success in maintaining control of the Senate, which gives it the prerogative to continue with appointments, and remembering that there are a lot of positions, of ambassador level positions, which remain to be filled, particularly in Latin America. And so that's something which will give confidence to Biden to move on with his policy in many areas, particularly in Latin America. But this other aspect, this defeat, this resounding defeat in Florida. I mean, the governor, Ron DeSantis, who is obviously shaping up to be a presidential contender for the Republicans, won by around 20% of the vote. It was effectively a landslide. He was reaching for votes deep into areas of Florida and southern Florida in which the Republicans have not won for many years. And it's interesting, if you actually look at the Latino vote in Florida, it's tilted heavily towards the Republicans, whereas in the rest of the country, although the Republicans have been making inroads into that population, the Hispanic population, it remains generally Democrat voting, whereas that's totally the contrary in Florida. And so obviously Florida's importance as an electoral well, not a bastion for either party, but as a source of very important votes in the Electoral College for the Senate, has diminished because the Democrats are inclined now to give up on the state and therefore abandon the need to appeal to its more conservative elements, rooted, of course, in the Cuban exile community. It's the opinions of the Cubans, the sort of conservative, anti-castrista population in Florida, which has not just retained its power and influence, but has disseminated its values and its take on Latin America to incoming waves of migrants from other parts of Latin America, particularly most recently from Venezuela. And these Venezuelan migrants are now also voting Republican. So I think there will be a sense, yes, that the Democrats are going to move on. I think we've seen that most recently, over the weekend, in the support for the new round of negotiations, in the deal which has been on Venezuela, which has begun in Mexico City, on the deal which the United States has unveiled, allowing Chevron to produce and extract more oil and trade it from Venezuela. And I think this is a sign of what's to come. Obviously, there are limits. And there's no doubt that Ron DeSantis will continue as a potential presidential candidate to make a lot of noise on Latin America. He's already sort of set out his stall on Latin America, as he said in June after the election of the new Colombian president. We've got a problem in this hemisphere with Marxism and totalitarianism. So although Democrats might not care about the state so much anymore and not feel that they've got much of a chance of ever winning it, the noise which will be coming out of that state, I don't think will diminish.
Thanks, Ivan. Olga, to turn back to Ukraine and this question of oversight, these have been massive sums of aid, and I just wonder if you could sketch out a bit for us what you imagine that oversight might entail. What are the things that will be of particular focus? If you have any sense of what oversight might mean in this coming Congress.
Thanks. So it's important to think about military aid and other sorts of aid differently, right? Some of the assistance is effectively budgetary support for Ukraine. Some of the assistance is equipment. Some of the assistance is money that's going actually to American contractors that are actually providing the aid either on the ground or through Ukrainian contractors on the ground. And there's a long history of different kinds of oversight for all of this. Some things are much easier to track than others. Big weapon systems are pretty easy to track. Guns are harder to track. Food aid can be harder to track. And you want to ask when you're developing oversight mechanisms, why are you doing it? And what are you trying to accomplish? When I was in Ukraine in September, one of the things I heard from humanitarian aid providers in Ukraine was that they had received a lot more demands for accounting of the assistance they were distributing, and that it was taking up a lot of time, right? So they were asking, is this what you want us to be doing, really? Or do you want us to be feeding people? Do you want us to be providing winter clothing? And the answer, of course, is both, right? Aid providers want to be able to do both. There are some things that's going to be almost impossible to track, though, right? You're not going to track every single bullet. So there's going to be, you're just going to have to be a real balance. We have a history of these things going badly in the past. And I think that's part of what's driving this is you can look at all the weapons that went into Afghanistan over the many years of war in Afghanistan, not just from the United States, and know that there was terrible accountability. Now, the good news when it comes to weapons is, for the time being, at least, the weapons are probably going to stay in Ukraine. The risk isn't that they're going to fall into the hands of bad guys. The risk is they're going to cost the good guys more to get because somebody's making some money on the distribution. And I think, so, kind of when it's things like this, again, on both the military and the humanitarian side, getting the Ukrainians involved, making sure that they're doing their own accountability and recognizing that, they have every incentive to do that, right? Because they also don't want waste. They also don't want fraud. That's going to be one aspect of it. But, I think a lot of it is making sure that it is both pragmatic and not performative. And that can be a tough thing for the Congress to do. So I think the administration is going to want to get ahead of it and make it clear that it does have good systems in place so they don't have to be legislated, that it's, to make it clear that it's already putting in best practices. And I think for the most part, that is a process that has begun.
So you mentioned being pragmatic and not performative as being a challenge. And so, Amanda, on the question of Taiwan and the performative pressures that might come from Congress, I wonder if you could reflect on what that might mean, that there might be this increasing rhetoric on the Biden administration being soft on China, rhetoric in terms of being drawing clear lines around Taiwan. Obviously, this comes after a period of some fraught relations, particularly after the Pelosi visit. So if you could just talk us through what that might look like, and with a Republican House lobbying increasing criticism of the Biden administration with respect to Taiwan policy, and whether there's a way to perhaps reconstitute something like the status quo ante before the Pelosi visit.
Right. So let me just provide maybe a few points of background so we can get into the sort of congressional element of it. As we all know, Taiwan remains the key point of contention right now in the US-China relationship. And the potential for words or actions from either party, US or China, to spark tensions remains high because each side is concerned, as you noted, that the other is changing the status quo. And the US is concerned that because of China's advancements in its military capabilities, that it will essentially be tempted to conduct a military invasion of Taiwan in order to achieve unification. China's worried that because of the level of strategic importance that the US is attaching to Taiwan, particularly in recent years, that US policy is actually incrementally changing and shifting towards support for Taiwan's permanent separation from the mainland, which is different from longstanding US policy. So, the key issue for US policy on Taiwan is not really whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans who are in control of Congress. It's really that there is a concerning degree of inconsistency in the administration's rhetoric, with the president making remarks that suggest that US policy has changed one day, and then turning around and telling the Chinese that US policy has not changed the next day. Congress has added to this incoherence, as you noted, with Speaker Pelosi's visit in August of this year, and previously the inclusion of some provisions in the Taiwan Policy Act. And let me come back to that and just set that aside for now. But in short, really, Washington should refrain from symbolic gestures that really do little to strengthen Taiwan's resilience and will force a response from Beijing. Effective US policy requires not only building up Taiwan's defense as a means of deterring China from an invasion, but also reassuring China that in doing so, the US is actually not supportive of Taiwan's formal independence. And so the inconsistencies in US rhetoric and between how the executive and legislative branches approach Taiwan, they really undercut the credibility of Washington's assurances to Beijing. And of course, this is dangerous because it increases the likelihood that Beijing will misunderstand American intentions and overreact on an issue that it considers at core. On the Taiwan Policy Act, this was, as you noted earlier, a draft passed the Senate, and the latest on that is, what was concerning in the content of that draft legislation is that there were provisions in there that would make US-Taiwan relations appear more official when longstanding practice is that the relationship is unofficial. But what is happening right now is that the parts of the Taiwan Policy Act that are related to increasing military aid to Taiwan, those parts are actually making its way through, but through the National Defense Authorization Act. And so there's a possibility that once those elements are passed through the NDAA, that might be the end of the rest of the Taiwan Policy Act, meaning that those elements of the draft legislation that would have been seen as most provocative by Beijing might not make it into a bill. But let's see what happens. But those elements of shoring up Taiwan's defense, that has a bipartisan consensus and support. And so those are the elements that we're seeing right now included in the NDAA.
Great, thank you. Ivan, if I could turn back to you. The US elections were preceded by elections in Brazil, which were maybe more tightly contested than was predicted, with Bolsonaro narrowly losing to Lula. But one of the interesting aspects of that election was the ways in which US politics sort of reverberated through some of the rhetoric we saw from Bolsonaro, rhetoric about the legitimacy of elections, and that gained credence really in 2020 following President Trump's defeat. One of the interesting outcomes of the midterms was at state level, where secretaries of state who were noted election deniers were defeated resoundingly across the board. I think for those looking and concerned about the health of US democracy, it was a kind of incremental positive step. And I wonder, do these small developments here in the US, looking at the fact that the election denialism was being touted by others in the region, do you imagine that this might have a salutary impact, particularly following Bolsonaro's defeat? Or do you think that these populist undercurrents are now something of a feature of politics, both in the US and in Latin America more broadly?
Thank you, Mark. I mean, I think on the question of Brazil, there was no doubt that there was a playbook which had been established by Trump after the election loss in 2020, that had been studied and congratulated by Bolsonaro's family, particularly his sons, and therefore was a very present risk which everybody in Brazil and outside was conscious of, that Bolsonaro had questioned the electoral system, and in the event of a slender loss in which he could grasp any elements or evidence of fraud, he would appeal against the result and go to the armed forces, which are, of course, one of his major constituencies of support. But it was the awareness of that which prepared particularly foreign governments to respond immediately to the election results. And it was also very important in that respect that the elections were carried out so effectively, quickly, and cleanly. So I think that there was obviously a feedback loop between what happened in the United States and what happened in Brazil, given the similarities between Bolsonaro and Trump. But I would say that more generally in Latin America, we're at quite a different, in some ways, democratic moment there, particularly if I compare it with Florida. But in Latin America, obviously, there is a shift, which is we've seen to the left in recent elections in Colombia, particularly in Brazil, in Peru, in Chile. And this is, and it's going to be difficult for the United States in the years ahead to handle its relations with Latin American countries. The notion that Latin America is going to be subject to some core US security, national security, trade, and diplomatic interests, and will obey without question is very much over. And it's interesting to see, I think, in the Biden administration, how the efforts at diplomatic engagement in Latin America have, despite the obstacles, obviously gradually increased in the understanding that each of these governments has to be treated in Latin America on its own merits and negotiated with. Thus, the engagement we've seen since March, the direct engagement with Venezuela, the efforts to reach out immediately to the new government in Colombia, the left-winger President Gustavo Petro, and discuss with him some of his demands around about security and counter-narcotics. I'm absolutely sure when Lula comes into power at the start of January, there will be a big US push to engage in the Brazilian government. But there's no doubt at the same time that if you look at these governments and you look at the diversity in Latin America today, the United States have to handle much more assertive, much less compliant governments for various reasons in different contexts. And yes, there are populist surges in Latin America, just as there is in the United States. I mean, they are very different between the two. In I think some of the socio-economic background of the voters for populism, but there is that surge, and it will present governments which are difficult to handle either from left or right. And so I think what the Biden administration is trying to do is to emphasize its presence and engagement, but at the same time, its core interests in the region are perhaps less profuse than they were before, restricted to a few very basic issues such as migration, such as some of the issues around security. and also understanding that it's not going to get its way so often on those issues. And I think this is a turn we're seeing in US policy towards Latin America, which is part and parcel of exactly these democratic challenges you mentioned, Michael.
Excellent. Feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box. I'm going to ask a few more questions before I open it up more broadly. One thing I wanted to touch on was separation of powers and perceptions of separation of powers. One of the features of the run-up to the Pelosi visit to Taiwan in the summer was a certain assumption, I think, that this was effectively being, that the Biden administration was acquiescing to the visit, and in effect that this was an expression of U.S. policy in a sense. And so I just wanted to turn back to you, Amanda, to get your sense of how much appreciation there is for the kind of unruly nature of the separation of powers. The fact that a Republican House is going to be taking positions, obviously not in coordination with the Biden administration, and how much that really impacts the kind of overall view of U.S. policy, and whether there's an ability, an appreciation to sort of weed out the performative from their actual underlying policy.
Right. For the Chinese, I think what we heard in the lead up to Pelosi's visit in state media, in official statements, was this insistence, really, that particularly because Pelosi is a Democrat and it's a Democratic administration, this feeling that the executive and Biden himself should be able to rein in his own people, in a sense. And that was the sort of propaganda external facing line that they took. I think to some extent, it is hard for the Chinese system to accept that the Biden administration officials couldn't convince Pelosi to not come to Taiwan. But I do think that, what made it worse, actually, in a way, was she and Biden actually had a call a couple of days before Pelosi came. And what was reported out of that call was that she personally appealed to Biden to convince Pelosi to not make the visit. And of course, we know what happened. The visit went through. And the response from Beijing was unprecedented. It was relatively controlled, but the scale of the military exercises that they staged in response was unprecedented. And so, I think to some extent that the Chinese, when you speak to some of the scholars, I think there is an understanding that actually the US executive was unhappy that this visit went forward. So I think amongst those who watch US politics quite closely, there was an understanding that actually the two branches were divided on this issue, and that to some extent, the administration's hands were tied, really, as soon as news of her visit was leaked to the media. I think it was pretty much set that she was going to come. But you also pointed to the potential for the future speaker, Kevin McCarthy's, a potential visit by him to Taiwan. McCarthy had mentioned in July, in the lead up to Pelosi's visit, that if he were made speaker, that he would also visit Taiwan. And we've already seen actually some Chinese state media make comments about this. So they are also watching for this event. And, the short of it is similar to the Pelosi visit. It's largely a symbolic gesture that will, at the end of the day, provide little substantive support to, I think, Taiwan's ability to deter a Chinese military invasion, if that is indeed the objective of such a visit. So if McCarthy goes, I mean, we're likely to see tensions spike again over Taiwan. All three parties really force down another round of tit for tat escalation that will be destabilizing and make this issue even more intractable. Possible responses by Beijing, there's two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, Pelosi's visit sort of broke the camel's back. It was unprecedented. So I'm not sure, she sort of broke that precedent already. So, Beijing will at a minimum have to match the show of resolve that they put on in response to her visit. And maybe it will just be that. But on the other hand, this time around, Beijing is facing considerable pressures at home. And it's past the political transition that secured Xi Jinping a third term. And that political transition was really the key focus of the Chinese leadership's attention for quite some time. And I think at the end of the day, served to restrain China's hands in their response to Pelosi. So it's very also possible that Beijing might find it in its interest to escalate beyond what they did in response to Pelosi's visit if McCarthy did go.
Thanks, Amanda. I have one more question that I'm going to pose, and I see that the Q&A box is starting to fill up. Please continue to add your questions there. But Olga, I wanted to ask about what the elections and your sense that Ukraine aid will continue, what that means for Europe and for NATO specifically. I think I heard some trepidation from Europeans in the run-up to the election about the future course of American policy, a sense that European policy really hinged on what the United States was going to do, and obviously I think some concern going back to 2016 about the unpredictable nature of American politics and what that might have in store in terms of these longstanding security partnerships. Do you think these electoral results will sort of buoy European solidarity? Do you think it will have an appreciable impact on the sustainability of this cohesion that we've seen, particularly with a tough winter coming with rising energy costs?
Thanks, Michael. I think that's a great question. You did hear an audible sigh of relief when the election results made their way across Europe as well. But I think the question is it over forever, or is it a respite? And do the 4 years of the Trump administration, are they a harbinger of things to come, or was it a blip? And Europeans don't know this any more than Americans know this. And I think that's going to be the challenge. There's a tendency in Europe to fall into the same kind of two camps, right? The idea that, okay, everything's good now, it's normal, we're back to we can rely on the United States, and we can develop policies on the basis of a United States here to stay. And then a view that the world is changing, the US is changing, it's impossible to predict the future, and American politics remain very volatile. So, okay, we dodged a bullet potentially with this election, but we don't know what's going to happen the next time. And I think even beyond that, the escalated war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion in February, has dragged US attention back to Europe in a way that Europeans, at least the Europeans who want an involved United States, might be happy about. But there's a recognition that overall the United States has not wanted to be dragged into Europe. So this question of just how much US do you need for European security going forward is going to come back. This isn't something that the next 2 years with this Congress are going to decide, but it is going to be a continuing topic on this side of the Atlantic and in the United States, for quite some time to come. And if the war continues for a long time, or if the war comes to an end, there's going to be reevaluation of the security order in Europe, of what kind of forces one needs where, and which countries have to supply these forces. And there's going to be a big demand for the United States to carry a heavy burden here. And the United States is going to be pulled in a whole lot of directions. And I think, this is not new. This is something we've been seeing develop for years, if not decades now. But kind of the current attention to Europe is not something that everyone can count on lasting.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box and the questions from our attendees. The first one is for you, Ivan. It's from Bernd Pickert, who is from newspaper Taz in Germany. And it's a question about differentiated policy. It says, apart from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and in part Bolivia, all the recently elected leftist governments in Latin America are democratic. Will the US be able to conduct a differentiated policy in this hemisphere when Republican rhetoric accuses Biden Democrats to be Castro-style communists, and the fact that this is particular rhetoric that resonates in Florida?
Well, I think that relates to what we were saying earlier about Florida. I think that rhetoric will continue. The Florida anti-Castro constituency will continue to see all examples of the left, democratic or otherwise, in Latin America as fundamentally malign, as contrary to the interests of the United States, as socialist, and as a threat. But of course, a lot of that has got to do with their own campaigning on US soil, which requires the demonization of the Democrats' party's left and the treatment of the Democrats as socialists in capitalist disguise, if you like. But it doesn't really. I don't think it will really affect the current administration's policy, because they have been very clear that they are, at least in their public statements, that they're willing to engage with every government which is democratically elected. And that they'll also understand that there are fundamental problems with democracy in Latin America when democracies can't deliver the goods which people rely on to maintain decent living conditions, above all, livelihoods and daily security. There was, and this has been a theme in the foreign policy towards Latin America in the Biden administration. And so I think what we will see is what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, with the US engagement with Petro, with the US engagement with Boric in Chile. Very interested in the position of Boric as a young left-wing leader who is critical of authoritarian steps in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and elsewhere. There is a very great interest in cultivating these new democratic leaders in the region. There is still very great concern, obviously, in the administration over those hardcore authoritarian regimes, particularly those in Nicaragua, and perhaps to a lesser extent, a less concern, or at least a more greater willingness to engage in Venezuela and Cuba. And I think there will be an effort to try and bring those authoritarian governments bit by bit, if at all possible, over to the democratic side, and to reaffirm the case for democracy in Latin America as the only political system which will guarantee a stability over the long term in the region. I believe that is the fundamental US point of view. A stable region is in the interest of US power, and it can only be stable if it is democratic. But I do fear that those authoritarian impulses will to a degree over the coming years, and with the economies in Latin America doing so badly at the moment, with a very difficult 2023 ahead, that there will be authoritarian moves in other countries. We've seen El Salvador moving in that direction under its very popular president, Nayib Bukele, and we could see this phenomenon elsewhere, particularly if some of the current crop of leaders feel that they need to radicalize in response to high levels of domestic or foreign opposition. So I think it's a delicate position. I think it may be more difficult to distinguish the two than is thought at the moment. But yes, there is a clear desire from the US government to treat the democratic left from the authoritarian left very differently.
Great, thank you. Amanda, I have a question for you from Maria Laura de Angelis. It's a question about something we haven't talked a lot about, but the capacity for US-China cooperation. And this question is about US-China cooperation on de-escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and non-proliferation in Northeast Asia. And so basically, in spite of the current fraught nature of relations, do you think this is an area where we might see any kinds of bilateral cooperation?
Thanks, Michael. On the whole, I am a bit pessimistic about that, about cooperation emerging. And the reasons are following. The sort of latest data point we have on that was the Xi-Biden meeting at the G20. And the US readout out of that meeting did note that the US side brought up potential cooperation on the Korean Peninsula, but the Chinese side notably did not mention this. And so that to me suggests that either that the Chinese has not fully bought into it, or that they're actually not ready to state what their position is in terms of cooperating with the US on that issue. There's a couple of sort of factors or interests that are driving China's calculus in terms of the Korean Peninsula. On the one hand, because of heightened competition with the US and the fact that there's increasing sort of polarization between the West. What China perceives is really the US establishing an anti-Western, a Western anti-China coalition. And it feels, as we've seen in their party Congress report, that the strategic environment that they face is really more hostile than ever as a result of US competition. And so they're in a moment where I think they're holding on fast to the friends that they've got. And Russia being one of them, but North Korea being another one. So, there's not much interest from that perspective in sort of using the political capital that they have to pressure North Korea into lowering tensions or to stop the missile tests. The other factor that pushes them in the direction of not cooperating with the US is that I don't think that Beijing is willing to spend their political capital until they see that they're going to get something concrete out of it from the US. So they have tended to approach cooperation with North Korea, with the US and North Korea from quite a transactional sort of perspective. Now, the reasons for them to work with the US or to help with diffusing tensions, those exist as well, but I'm not sure that they're more compelling. And the most important reason is really that they would be helping to address a key rationale that is driving both Japanese, we can call it rearmament, decision to spend more on their defense, but also US ROK military cooperation. And those are things that are adding to threats in their immediate neighborhood. And a more threatening North Korea, a North Korea that is firing more missiles into the waters of China's periphery, actually drives actions from the ROK and Japan that work against China's interests.
Thank you. Just to note, I know there's been a broad range of questions posed. I apologize, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we're trying to limit the questions to those that can be directed directly to our current panelists. So other regions will have to wait for another day. Ivan, I have another question for you from Juan Pablo Medina Biquel on Colombia, and talking about potential Senate and Biden administration support for Petro's desire to review hardline security policies on the war on drugs.
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. Thank you for that, Juan Pablo. We saw Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, visit Colombia in October, appear alongside President Petro for a very interesting press conference in which he declared that he was broadly aligned, the US was broadly aligned with the way Petro was thinking about security policy, by which he meant that Petro wants to move the focus of counter-narcotics, in particularly away from forced eradication, away from targeting the weakest parts of the drug supply chain, the farmers cultivating coca, the low-lying operatives, towards the highest levels. So the business links, moving large amounts of product to the final markets. And this is something which the US obviously can't really disapprove of. Trying to move up the supply chain to hit the highest levels is something which there is not a problem. Forced eradication has not proved effective over the last 20 years in reducing supply over the medium to long term. You might eradicate quite a few hectares, but they will quickly be replanted. That is the experience from Colombia. And I think US policymakers, the US Embassy in Bogota is also perfectly aware of this. I think where concern grows a little bit is the question of changing extraditions to the United States, because within the new terms of the Total Peace Law, which Colombia's Congress passed in October, extraditions to the United States are among those items which can be, in principle, negotiated. So the question of the submission to national justice authorities and the right of national justice authorities, judicial authorities in Colombia to try people is part of what can be negotiated with armed and criminal groups in the plan of the Petro government to engage with all these different outfits and see whether they can demobilize. So that's one issue. I think the other issue is a bit bigger, a bit more amorphous at the moment, which is Petro's desire, clearly expressed in the UN General Assembly and with very great support from a number of other leaders in Latin America, to question the whole paradigm of the war on drugs, the idea that certain classes of drugs should be prohibited in production and in use, and that there should be this ongoing effort to stamp them out, even if experience tells us in the last few decades that it doesn't work, and that prohibition simply increases the level of profits and therefore the temptation for very violent groups to enter the supply chain. So that questioning is something which I would imagine certain parts of the US government in the Biden administration are sympathetic towards, and they could look at more efficient, streamlined ways of dealing with drugs, ones which respond more to the harm they really do to consumers. But I think that the drug war bureaucracy, if you like, in the United States is not going to be so open to reconsidering those issues. There are people who have invested their entire lifetimes in fighting drugs at the supply and demand level and maybe don't want to abandon the cause now. So I'm not sure that there will be so much alignment with Petro on that question. And if he does push hard for that, and does push for a change across Latin America, I would imagine that there might be a bit more resistance from the high levels of government.
Olga, we have a question on Central Asia from Ethan Walensky-Lanford, talking about US policy towards Central Asia in light of China's increased infrastructure involvement in the region, but also the significant influx of migrants fleeing conscription, Russian conscription, that is. But so I wonder if you have any thoughts about where Central Asia sits in US policy thinking in light of the war in Ukraine.
So I think it is going to be really interesting to watch what happens in Central Asia in coming years. So there, and in the South Caucasus and other places where Russia had been a country with a great deal of weight, where it retains a certain amount of weight, the weakness revealed in the way that it has prosecuted its war in Ukraine has led a lot of the leaderships in these countries to have a little less faith in Russian capacity, and moreover, the brutality and the very violation of sovereignty inherent in the way it has waged its war in Ukraine has made them more nervous about relations with Russia. So you're seeing more instability and unrest in some of these countries, something that has been happening for a while, and a recognition that Russia is probably not going to be the solution to any of these problems. Now, in Central Asia specifically, we've seen increased Chinese economic involvement for quite some time, and that's been useful, critical, in fact, to some of these economies. In terms of how U.S. policy will evolve, well, I think this is one of these big questions for the United States is, where does it have capacity to act? What can it actually do? And what how does it want to prioritize its resources? And I don't know that a decision has been made on the future of U.S. policy in Central Asia. In general, Central Asia is somewhere on the third tier of U.S. policy decision-making. And there are certainly people in the U.S. government who care deeply about Central Asia, but this isn't, I think, something that the president pays attention to on a daily basis. This isn't a part of the world that's at the top of the agenda for members of Congress either. So, I think we at Crisis Group will be watching what happens in Central Asia. But I think to a large extent, the people of the region are also trying to figure out what all of this means, what it means to have an influx of Russian men, what it means to have the unrest that we've already seen, what it means to have a Russia to the north that isn't perhaps as strong as you thought it was, but is potentially more dangerous.
Great. We have time for one last question, and it's to you, Ivan, on the impact of Lula's return to power, and a question, this is, I guess, not so much about U.S. policy per se, but about the prospects for the revival of regional integration mechanisms.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we are very hopeful that Lula, as in his first two administrations, will push the agenda of regional solidarity. It's so badly needed in Latin America, particularly after the COVID pandemic, in which we saw the effects of a breakdown in regional links. But I would say very briefly that if it's going to be done again, it would be best done without the mistakes which were made on the first occasion when Lula was very active in pushing for the creation of the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR. That there was this ideological bias to these new regional organizations, and centre-right conservative governments didn't really feel part of them. What we know at the moment is that there is a left-wing tide in Latin America. There's a sufficient quorum of governments to create regional institutions if they like. But we also know that there is a huge amount of political churn in the region. This left-wing tide won't last long. There was a centre-right, right-wing tide from 2015 to 2018, and look what happened to that. I don't expect all these left-wing governments to last very long. They will be replaced. There will be centre and centre-right challenges, populist challenges from the right as well. And it's important to try and build regional institutions robust enough to survive political changes in individual countries. And that will really be the challenge for Lula, I think.
Thanks, Ivan. I think that wraps up our time. I just want to thank my colleagues for a really thoughtful discussion. Thanks to all of our attendees and the really excellent questions. Apologies that we couldn't get to all of them. And just to note that the event was recorded and is available on our YouTube channel, the Crisis Group YouTube channel, and also on our website. Many thanks for joining us today, and hope to